I'm Edward, and thank you for being part of our growing cozy community. Tonight, a special greeting to Quebec City, Canada. Tell us where you're listening from, and do you keep old family photographs tucked away in albums of your own? Don't forget to subscribe. Now, make yourself comfortable and enjoy the story. Chapter 1. The Album Brought Down from the Cupboard. There is a quality to late October in St. Mary Mead that encourages reflection. The year has turned decidedly toward winter, though not yet with any harshness. The light fades earlier each afternoon, and with it comes a gentle urgency to complete the small tasks that have been deferred since summer. Curtains are drawn with more deliberation. Fires are laid with greater care. And visits, when they are paid, carry a certain weight of intention that the careless warmth of June would never acquire. Miss Marple, seated by her front window with her knitting, had observed this seasonal shift with the same quiet attention she brought to all matters of village life. The garden beyond the glass had given up its last roses. The Michaelmas daisies were fading now, their purple heads bowing under the first real cold of the season. She had spent the morning sorting through her linen cupboard, a task she undertook each autumn with methodical satisfaction. It was remarkable, she reflected, how much one accumulated over the years, and how reluctant one became to part with things that had once seemed essential. People were much the same in this regard. Autumn encouraged them to sort through drawers, to reconsider what they had kept, and occasionally to discover that what had been carefully preserved no longer served its original purpose. Or perhaps, she thought, touching her needles together in their familiar rhythm, it served a purpose they had not initially recognised. The disturbance, when it came, arrived, as such things often did in St. Mary Mead, quietly and wrapped in the language of ordinary sorrow. Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard had died peacefully in her sleep 3 nights previous. There had been no shock in it, no sudden tragedy to disrupt the village's equilibrium. She had been 78 years old, widowed for the past 6 years, and had lived in the same neat brick house on the Ellingham Road for nearly half a century. Her passing was met with that particular mixture of sadness and acceptance that accompanies the death of someone who has lived a full life and caused no trouble in the living of it. Miss Marple had known Mrs. Pritchard in the way one knows a neighbour of many years, through church attendance, occasional encounters at the draper's, and the small exchanges of village courtesy that accumulate into a kind of distant familiarity. She had been a tall woman, spare in figure, with grey hair she wore in an unfashionable but dignified knot. Her manner had been reserved, without being cold, and she had possessed that quality of steadiness that people value highly in a village where eccentricity is tolerated, but reliability is prized. She had not been a woman who invited intimacy. Miss Marple recalled that Mrs. Pritchard's conversations had been pleasant but contained, never straying into personal revelation or complaint. She had served on the church flower committee for many years, always arriving punctually with her contribution and departing just as promptly once the arrangements were complete. She had been kind to children in an abstract sort of way, offering a word of encouragement or a sweet from her handbag, but she had never seemed entirely comfortable in their boisterous company. It was generally understood that Mrs. Pritchard had married rather late, at 35, to a gentleman from the next county who had been connected with banking. The marriage had been childless, though respectable, and Mr. Pritchard's death had seemed to affect his widow less dramatically than might have been expected. She had continued her routines with the same quiet discipline, attended the same gatherings, and maintained the same pleasant but distant demeanour that had characterised her throughout her residence in St. Mary Mead. The funeral had taken place that morning, a modest affair conducted with the dignified restraint that Mrs. Pritchard herself would have approved. The church had been respectably full, though not crowded, and the service had proceeded without incident. Miss Marple, seated in her usual pew, had noted the presence of Mrs. Pritchard's niece, Miss Lucy Pritchard, who had travelled down from London for the occasion. Lucy Pritchard was a woman of perhaps 40, with a soft, pleasant face and the sort of apologetic manner that suggested she had spent much of her life attempting not to impose. She wore her dark coat and hat with unassuming propriety, and her grief, while genuine, was expressed quietly. She had thanked each attendee personally as they filed past after the service, her voice steady, but her eyes reddened from recent tears. It was Lucy who had arranged the condolence tea to be held that very afternoon at Mrs. Pritchard's house. Miss Marple had accepted the invitation, as had most of the village's more established residents. Such gatherings served an important function, she knew. They allowed the living to demonstrate their respect for the deceased, to offer comfort to those left behind, and to begin the delicate process of redistributing the social connections that death had disrupted. She arrived at the house shortly after 3 o'clock, accompanied by her nephew's wife, who had driven over from the neighbouring village, and would return to collect her within the hour. The afternoon had turned grey and still, with a thickness in the air that suggested rain before nightfall. The house itself stood slightly back from the road, fronted by a neat gravel drive and bordered by a privet hedge that had been kept meticulously trimmed. Miss Marple noticed, as she approached the front door, that the garden showed the same careful attention to order that had characterised Mrs. Pritchard herself. The beds were edged precisely, the lawn recently mown, and not a leaf had been permitted to remain on the pathway. Inside, the house maintained that same quality of restrained propriety. The furniture was good without being ostentatious, the carpets well maintained, and everything arranged with a precision that spoke of long habit. Lucy Pritchard greeted them in the hallway, her manner gracious despite her evident fatigue. Tea had been laid in the front sitting room, where a modest fire burned in the grate and the heavy curtains had been drawn back to admit what remained of the afternoon light. A dozen or so people had already gathered, speaking in the lowered tones that funeral gatherings seemed to require. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea and a small sandwich and positioned herself near the window where she might observe without appearing to do so. The conversation followed predictable patterns. Mrs. Pritchard was praised for her steadiness, her discretion, her unfailing attendance at church functions. Someone mentioned her skill with flower arrangements. Another recalled her generosity in contributing to the Christmas bazaar each year. The tributes were sincere but curiously impersonal, Miss Marple noted, as though the speakers were describing a figure they had admired from a distance rather than truly known. It was perhaps 20 minutes into the gathering when Lucy Pritchard carried in the album. It was a substantial thing, bound in dark leather that had cracked slightly with age, and clearly heavy from the careful way Lucy bore it. She set it down on the low table near the fireplace with a soft thump, and the conversation paused momentarily as people turned to look. "I found this while sorting through Aunt Eleanor's things," Lucy said, her voice carrying that same apologetic quality Miss Marple had noted earlier. "It's the family photograph album. I thought perhaps people might like to see it, to remember happier times." The suggestion was met with murmurs of approval, and several people moved closer to the table. Lucy opened the album carefully, and Miss Marple observed that it had been wrapped in brown paper, which now lay folded to one side. "It was kept in the cupboard in her bedroom," Lucy continued, addressing no one in particular. "Quite high up, actually. I nearly didn't find it at all." The album's pages were thick and slightly yellowed, separated by tissue paper that crackled faintly as they were turned. The photographs themselves were mounted with corner tabs, and someone had written neat captions beneath each one in a careful feminine hand. As the gathering pressed closer to look, Miss Marple maintained her position by the window, but watched with quiet attention. She observed that some people greeted the album with genuine interest, leaning in to examine the photographs and exclaiming over faces they recognised. Others, however, showed a more curious response. They glanced at the pages, made brief comments, and then withdrew, finding sudden reason to refresh their tea or engage in conversation with someone across the room. It was the sort of behaviour Miss Marple had learned to notice over many years of observation. Interest was easy to understand, but restraint, particularly when it arrived suddenly and without obvious cause, was often more revealing. She moved slightly closer, enough to glimpse the pages as they were turned. The photographs showed the usual progression of family life, stiff Victorian portraits giving way to more casual Edwardian groups, then the smaller, more intimate photographs of the 20s and 30s. There were children in sailor suits, young women in garden party dresses, and elderly relations posed formally in drawing rooms. Lucy stood beside the table, offering explanations when asked, her manner kind and unassuming. She spoke warmly of her aunt's devotion to family, of how carefully the album had been maintained, of how much it meant to have these memories preserved. Miss Marple sipped her tea and continued to watch. She observed which photographs drew lengthy examination and which were passed over quickly. She noted who asked questions and who remained silent, and she reflected, as she had many times before, that people revealed themselves not only in what they chose to remember, but in how carefully they chose to forget. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall against the window pane, soft and insistent, as though autumn itself were pressing closer to the glass. Chapter 2. A Death That Rearranged Things. The rain that had threatened throughout the afternoon began in earnest as the gathering settled into its quieter phase. Those who had arrived early and paid their respects were beginning to take their leave, murmuring final condolences to Lucy Pritchard and retrieving coats from the hallway stand. Others, perhaps feeling less pressed by obligation or more genuinely curious about the album, had drawn chairs closer to the table and were examining its contents with increasing attention. Miss Marple had repositioned herself slightly, accepting a second cup of tea from Lucy and settling into a chair that afforded a clear view of both the album and those who gathered around it. The fire had been built up against the dampness, and the room had acquired that particular quality of contained warmth that makes the world beyond the windows seem very far away indeed. Mrs. Bantry, the vicar's wife, was turning the pages with careful fingers, her reading glasses perched on her nose. She was a comfortable woman of Miss Marple's own generation, given to sensible shoes and a forthright manner that sometimes bordered on the tactless. She had been acquainted with Mrs. Pritchard through years of parish work, though Miss Marple suspected the acquaintance had never deepened into genuine friendship. "What lovely photographs," Mrs. Bantry remarked, addressing the room at large. "You can see the care that went into mounting them. Everything's so neat and orderly." "Aunt Eleanor was always meticulous," Lucy said softly. She had taken a seat slightly apart from the group, her teacup balanced on her knee. "She kept everything just so. I remember as a child being rather intimidated by how tidy her house was." "But you visited often?" This came from Colonel Wexford, a retired military man who lived on the far side of the village and attended church with the regularity of one fulfilling a duty rather than pursuing a devotion. "Oh yes, quite. Regularly when I was young. Less so in recent years, I'm afraid. Work commitments, you understand." Lucy's expression suggested this was a source of some regret. "Though we corresponded faithfully. Aunt Eleanor was an excellent letter writer." Miss Marple filed this information away with interest. Letters, in her experience, often revealed what conversation concealed. She wondered if Lucy had kept those letters, and whether they might prove illuminating in ways the writer had not intended. The album's early pages depicted the expected progression of Victorian family life. There was a wedding photograph, stiffly formal, showing a young couple whose features were difficult to discern beneath the solemnity of the occasion. Several pages were devoted to family groups arranged on lawns or before substantial houses, everyone frozen in the uncomfortable immobility that early photography had required. "Is that Mrs. Pritchard as a child?" Mrs. Bantry asked, pointing to a small figure in a white dress standing beside a woman in elaborate mourning attire. Lucy leaned forward to look. Yes, that would be her with her mother. "My great-grandmother. She died when Aunt Eleanor was quite young, I believe. Consumption, or so I was told." "How sad," someone murmured, and there was a brief moment of respectful silence. The pages turned, and the photographs grew more recent. The Edwardian era emerged in garden party scenes and seaside outings, the fashions changing from bustles to looser, more graceful lines. Mrs. Pritchard appeared with increasing frequency, growing from a solemn child into a tall, serious young woman with dark hair and a reserved expression. It was when they reached the photographs from the late 20s that Miss Marple noticed the shift in the room's atmosphere. The change was subtle, but unmistakable. Mrs. Bantry, who had been commenting freely on each image, suddenly fell silent. Colonel Wexford cleared his throat and reached for his teacup. Miss Debenham, who ran the post office and had known everyone's business for the past 30 years, glanced at one particular photograph and then deliberately turned her attention to smoothing her skirt. The photograph in question showed a garden party clearly taken in summer. A group of young people were arranged on a terrace, some seated, others standing. The women wore light dresses with dropped waists, and the men were in flannels and blazers. It was the sort of casual, happy scene that must have been photographed 1,000 times in 1,000 English gardens during that golden period between the wars. But among the group, standing slightly apart, though still within the frame, was a young man whose face drew the eye despite his peripheral position. He was tall and fair-haired, with the kind of open, pleasant features that suggest good humour and an easy-going nature. His hand rested on the back of a chair, and he appeared to be looking at someone outside the photograph's frame. Mrs. Bantry turned the page rather quickly. Lovely gardens they had in those days, she said, her voice carrying a determined brightness. Before the war, changed everything, of course. Lucy, who had risen to offer more tea, paused beside the table. That was taken at Maplewood House, I think. The Havisham's place. They sold it in the 30s. Did they indeed? Colonel Wexford said, though his tone suggested this information held no particular interest for him. Miss Marple observed that no one had asked about the young man in the photograph. This seemed to her a curious omission, given the general interest in identifying faces and recalling names. She sipped her tea and waited. The next few pages contained more photographs from the same period. There were tennis parties and picnics, formal dinners and Christmas gatherings. The young man appeared in several of them, always positioned with that same quality of slight apartness, as though he belonged to the group but not quite comfortably within it. It was Miss Debenham who finally addressed what everyone else seemed determined to ignore. "That's Thomas Avery, isn't it?" she said, her finger hovering over one of the photographs. "I'd quite forgotten he had been part of that set." There was a brief silence. Lucy looked at the photograph with an expression of polite interest, though Miss Marple suspected she knew perfectly well who the young man was. "Oh, that was all sorted out," Mrs. Bantry said quickly, as though someone had raised an objection rather than simply identified a person. "Ancient history, really." "He didn't stay long in the village, as I recall," Colonel Wexford added. His tone was carefully neutral, the voice of a man who wishes to acknowledge a fact while simultaneously dismissing its importance. "No, he moved away quite suddenly," Miss Debenham agreed. "To Canada, wasn't it? Or perhaps Australia, somewhere abroad at any rate." Lucy had returned to her chair. She sat very still, her teacup forgotten in her hands. "I never knew him, of course," she said quietly. "This would have been well before my time, but I believe Aunt Eleanor spoke of him once or twice. An old friend from her youth," she said. Miss Marple noted the careful phrasing. An old friend, not a particular friend or a dear friend, but simply old, as though time alone was sufficient to explain both the connection and its dissolution. The album continued to reveal its contents. There were more photographs from the late 20s and early 30s, documenting the same circle of friends and acquaintances. Thomas Avery appeared in perhaps a dozen of them, always present but never quite central. And then, rather abruptly, he disappeared from the record altogether. The photographs that followed showed Mrs. Pritchard alone or in the company of other women, her expression growing gradually more composed and distant. There were fewer informal scenes and more formal occasions, church fetes and committee meetings, the sorts of gatherings where one's presence was noted and one's contribution appreciated, but where genuine warmth was neither expected nor particularly encouraged. And then, on a page devoted to the year 1936, there appeared a wedding photograph. Mrs. Pritchard, no longer young but still handsome in her neat suit and hat, stood beside a solid-looking gentleman of middle age. They were posed before a church door, surrounded by a modest group of well-wishers. The bride's expression was pleasant but unrevealing, suggesting satisfaction rather than joy. "That would be Mr. Pritchard, of course," Mrs. Bantry said, her relief at having reached safer territory evident in her voice. "A very suitable match, as I recall. He was something in banking, wasn't he?" "In the neighbouring county," Lucy confirmed. "They met through mutual acquaintances, I believe. It was considered quite a good marriage." Miss Marple wondered who had considered it so and what criteria they had applied in making that judgment. Mr. Pritchard, from his photograph, appeared to be a man of steady temperament and respectable means, which were certainly valuable qualities in a husband. But whether they had been sufficient to satisfy whatever hopes or desires Mrs. Pritchard might have harboured was another question entirely. The pages following the wedding were notably sparse. There were a few photographs of holidays and family gatherings, all maintaining that same quality of pleasant respectability. And then, rather abruptly, the entries stopped altogether. The final third of the album contained only empty pages, their corner tabs waiting for photographs that had never been mounted. Lucy noticed this as well. "I'd forgotten about that," she said, almost to herself. How strange that she simply stopped adding to it. Perhaps she simply lost interest, Colonel Wexford suggested. These things happen. One starts a project with great enthusiasm and then finds one hasn't the time or inclination to maintain it. Perhaps, Lucy said, though her tone suggested she found this explanation less than entirely convincing. The gathering was beginning to disperse in earnest now. The rain had settled into a steady downpour, and people were gathering their belongings with the resigned acceptance of those who have no choice but to venture out into unpleasant weather. Lucy moved among them with quiet grace, thanking each person for coming and accepting their final expressions of sympathy. Miss Marple prepared to leave as well, though she took her time about it, waiting until most of the others had departed. As she stood in the hallway drawing on her gloves, she observed Lucy carefully closing the album and returning it to its brown paper wrapping. "It's a precious thing," Miss Marple said gently. "A family record kept with such care." Lucy looked up, and for a moment her pleasant, apologetic expression gave way to something more complex. "Yes," she said quietly. Though I'm not entirely certain what it's meant to record. The life my aunt lived, or the life she might have lived instead." It was, Miss Marple reflected as she stepped out into the rain, a question worth considering, and one that the album itself, for all its carefully mounted photographs, might not be prepared to answer. Chapter 3, Faces Remembered Selectively. The following morning brought clearer skies and a crispness to the air that suggested winter was preparing to make its presence felt in earnest. Miss Marple spent the early hours attending to her correspondence, a task she approached with the same methodical care she brought to most aspects of her life. There were letters to be answered, a note of condolence to be written to Lucy Pritchard, and a brief missive to her nephew Raymond regarding the reliability of the new gardener he had recommended. It was while she was sealing the envelope to Lucy that she found herself thinking again about the photograph album and the curious way certain images had been received. Memory, she reflected, was a peculiar faculty. People often believed they remembered events as they had actually occurred, when in truth they remembered only their own interpretation of those events, refined and edited over time until the original impression had been quite breathed beneath layers of more comfortable narrative. She had observed this phenomenon many times in St. Mary Mead, where the same incident could be recalled in dramatically different ways depending on who was doing the recalling and what purpose that recollection served. A quarrel that one person remembered as a minor disagreement might be described by another as a serious breach, while a third party might insist that nothing untoward had occurred at all. It was not necessarily that anyone was lying, though that occasionally happened. More often it was simply that people shaped their memories to fit the lives they had subsequently lived. The album, she suspected, had disrupted this comfortable arrangement. Whatever Thomas Avery's connection to Mrs. Pritchard had been, the village had clearly reached some consensus about how it ought to be remembered, and the photographs, by their very existence, had challenged that consensus in ways that made people distinctly uneasy. These reflections were interrupted by a knock at the door. Miss Marple's maid showed in Mrs. Bantry, who entered with the purposeful air of someone who has come to discuss a matter of importance, but wishes to appear as though the visit were merely social. "I hope I'm not calling too early," Mrs. Bantry said, settling herself into the chair Miss Marple indicated, "but I wanted to have a word with you about yesterday. Or rather awkward, I thought." Miss Marple resumed her own seat and waited with the patience of someone who knows that pressing for information often results in receiving less of it. "The album, I mean," Mrs. Bantry continued. "Poor Lucy bringing it out like that. Well-intentioned, of course, but perhaps not entirely wise. It seemed a natural gesture, Miss Marple said mildly, a way of sharing memories of her aunt. Oh, quite. But you see, there were things in it that might have been better left undisturbed. Not everyone present would have understood the full context, and misunderstandings can be so unfortunate. Miss Marple began a fresh row of her knitting, her needles moving with their customary rhythm. I noticed that certain photographs seemed to prompt more interest than others. Mrs. Bantry shifted slightly in her chair. The ones with Thomas Avery, you mean? Yes, well, that was all rather a long time ago, and I don't suppose there's any harm in discussing it now, though one must be careful not to gossip. This last comment was delivered with the slight defensiveness of someone who knows perfectly well they are about to engage in precisely the activity they claim to deplore. He appeared in several photographs, Miss Marple observed, always rather on the periphery, I noticed. Yes, that would be typical of him. Pleasant enough young man, but never quite fitted in somehow. Not that anyone held that against him, you understand. It was simply that he was of a different class, really. His people were in trade. This was offered as though it explained everything, and in the social calculus of 1920s England, Miss Marple supposed it rather did. He was part of Mrs. Pritchard's circle, though, she said. The photograph suggested he attended the same gatherings. Oh, he was tolerated well enough. Eleanor's father had business dealings with the Avery family, I believe. Something to do with property, so young Thomas was invited to things, particularly after his own father died, and left him rather better situated than one might have expected. But there was always a certain awkwardness about it. Mrs. Bantry paused to accept the tea Miss Marple offered, adding sugar with a liberal hand. The difficulty came, she continued, stirring her cup with unnecessary vigour, when it became clear that Eleanor had developed a certain fondness for him. Quite unsuitable, of course. Her family was very old, very respectable. The Pritchards had been in the county for generations, and Thomas, well-meaning though he was, simply wasn't of that world. Yet they were friends, Miss Marple said. More than friends, according to some. There was talk of an understanding between them. Nothing official, mind you, but the sort of thing that developed between young people when they spend too much time in each other's company, without proper supervision. Miss Marple reflected that this last comment revealed a great deal about Mrs. Bantry's view of romance, though perhaps not in the way she intended. I take it the understanding did not result in an engagement, she said. Oh, it did. That was the problem. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping though they were quite alone. They actually announced it, back in 1928. Caused quite a stir, I can tell you. Eleanor's family was horrified, and Thomas's people weren't much happier. Trade families are often the first to object when their children marry beneath them socially, even if the other party has the better lineage. But the engagement ended, Miss Marple said, quite abruptly. One day they were engaged, and the next Thomas had left the village entirely, went abroad, as I mentioned yesterday. The official story was that incompatibility had been discovered, all very civilized and mutual. But that wasn't the truth of it at all. Mrs. Bantry paused, as though considering whether to continue. Miss Marple waited, her needles clicking steadily. There was some sort of scandal, Mrs. Bantry said finally, involving another member of Eleanor's family. I never knew the full details, mind you. These things were hushed up very effectively in those days, but the general understanding was that Thomas left to prevent the scandal from becoming public knowledge. He did it for Eleanor's sake, so they said, to protect the family name. How very noble of him, Miss Marple murmured. Yes, well, whether it was nobility or simply recognition that he was outmatched by the family's determination, I couldn't say, but he went, and that was the end of it. Eleanor married some years later, as you saw in the photograph. Mr. Pritchard was entirely suitable, and everyone agreed it was for the best. Including Mrs. Pritchard herself? Mrs. Bantry looked momentarily disconcerted by this question. I suppose she must have thought so. She made a respectable life for herself, after all. Better than she would have had with Thomas Avery, trade connections or no trade connections. Miss Marple considered this assessment. In her experience, respectability was often a consolation prize awarded to those who had been denied what they actually wanted, but she did not say this aloud. "And Mr. Avery never returned to England?" she asked instead. "Not that I'm aware of. I believe he made quite a success of himself wherever he went. Someone said they'd heard he'd married and had children, though I couldn't swear to the accuracy of that. One loses track of people once they've left the village. Unless they appear in photograph albums," Miss Marple said. Mrs. Bantry had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "Yes, well, that's rather the point, isn't it? The album brought it all back in a way that some people found rather unsettling. Colonel Wexford, for instance, knew the family quite well in those days, and Miss Debenham's sister was very close to Eleanor at the time. Seeing those photographs again after all these years, well, it reminded them of things that had been better forgotten. Or things that had been deliberately misremembered," Miss Marple suggested gently. Mrs. Bantry set down her teacup with a slight clatter. "I'm not sure I take your meaning. Only that memory can be very selective. We remember what suits us, and we forget what doesn't. But photographs don't have that luxury. They show what was actually there, whether we wish it or not." "I suppose that's true." Mrs. Bantry rose, gathering her gloves and handbag. "At any rate, I thought you should know the background, in case Lucy asks you about it. She seemed rather puzzled by people's reactions yesterday, and I wouldn't want her to go stirring things up unnecessarily." Miss Marple saw her visitor to the door with the proper expressions of thanks for the call. As she returned to her sitting room, she reflected that Mrs. Bantry's account, while undoubtedly containing elements of truth, had also been carefully shaped to present a particular narrative. The story of an unsuitable match ended by mutual agreement, with Thomas Avery departing nobly to spare the family embarrassment, was exactly the sort of tale a village would construct to explain away something more complicated and potentially more troubling. The question was what that something might have been, and whether the photograph album, with its carefully preserved images and its conspicuously empty pages, might offer some clue to the answer. She returned to her knitting, but her mind was elsewhere. In her experience, when people insisted that matters were best left undisturbed, it was often because they feared what might be discovered if anyone looked too closely. And when they claimed that everyone had agreed something was for the best, it usually meant that at least one person had been persuaded to accept something very far from what they wanted. The album had been kept in a cupboard, wrapped carefully and placed high up where it wouldn't be encountered by accident. Mrs. Pritchard had stopped adding to it after her marriage, leaving those empty pages as silent testimony to a future that had failed to materialize, and the village, when confronted with images of Thomas Avery, had responded with the sort of collective evasiveness that suggested they knew more than they wished to acknowledge. It was, Miss Marple thought, very much like the behaviour of people who had agreed long ago on what the truth ought to be, and who found it deeply inconvenient when evidence appeared that might contradict their agreed-upon version of events. She wondered what Lucy would make of it all. The girl had seemed genuinely puzzled by the reaction she'd witnessed, which suggested she had been told the official story but had never been given reason to question it. Whether she would pursue the matter further remained to be seen. But Miss Marple suspected that the album, having been brought down from its cupboard after so many years, was not quite ready to be returned to obscurity just yet. Chapter 4. An Engagement No One Mentions. The days following Mrs. Bantry's visit brought that particular quality of stillness that sometimes descends upon a village when something has been spoken of just enough to satisfy curiosity, but not quite enough to resolve it. People went about their business with their usual routines intact, but Miss Marple detected in their greetings and chance encounters a certain watchfulness, as though everyone were waiting to see what might happen next. She had received a note from Lucy Pritchard, brief but warmly expressed, thanking her for attending the condolence tea and for her kind letter. Lucy mentioned that she would be remaining in St. Mary Mead for another week or two to complete the sorting of her aunt's effects, and expressed hope that they might have an opportunity to speak more fully. Miss Marple had written back suggesting tea at her own cottage, an invitation Lucy had accepted with what seemed like genuine pleasure. The afternoon Lucy's visit arrived with that soft grey quality peculiar to early November, when the light seems to have given up attempting brightness and settled instead for a kind of gentle persistence. Miss Marple had prepared the sitting room with particular care, ensuring the fire was well established and the tea things arranged with precision. She had also, though she would not have admitted to any deliberate strategy, positioned herself so that her guests would be drawn naturally to the most comfortable chair, the one that encouraged confidence through its very arrangement. Lucy arrived precisely at the appointed hour, carrying with her a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I found this among Aunt Eleanor's things," she said as Miss Marple relieved her of her coat and gloves. "It's a photograph of the church fete from several years ago. I noticed you in it and thought you might like to have it." It was a thoughtful gesture, and Miss Marple expressed appropriate gratitude as she unwrapped the package. The photograph showed the vicar's garden filled with the usual complement of stalls and visitors, everyone frozen in the self-conscious poses that cameras seemed to inspire. She identified herself near the white elephant table, looking rather stern in her best hat. "How kind of you to think of it," she said, setting the photograph on the mantelpiece. "Your aunt must have been very fond of such mementos. She kept at everything," Lucy said, accepting a cup of tea and settling into the indicated chair. "Every programme from every event, every church bulletin, every invitation. Her desk drawers were full of them, all sorted chronologically and tied with ribbon. It seemed such a careful way of preserving her life." "And yet she stopped adding to the photograph album," Miss Marple observed, passing the plate of biscuits. Lucy's expression clouded slightly. "Yes, I'd been thinking about that. It seemed so unlike her, given how meticulous she was about everything else. I wondered if perhaps the album became too heavy to manage comfortably, or if mounting photographs had become too troublesome for her eyesight." She spoke as though trying to convince herself of these explanations, and Miss Marple recognised the tone of someone who suspects a truth but is not quite ready to acknowledge it. "The album was kept rather carefully put away," Miss Marple said gently, "wrapped in paper and stored high in a cupboard. That suggests it held some particular significance." "I thought so too." Lucy set down her teacup with careful precision. "Miss Marple, I hope you won't think me presumptuous, but I've been meaning to ask you about something. At the condolence tea, when people were looking at the album, I noticed a certain awkwardness, particularly when we reached the photographs from the late 1920s. "The ones showing Mr. Avery," Miss Marple said. Lucy looked relieved that the name had been spoken aloud. "Yes, exactly. No one seemed willing to discuss him directly, though he appeared in quite a number of the photographs, and when Miss Debenham finally mentioned his name, everyone seemed rather eager to change the subject." "Villages can be protective of their histories," Miss Marple said, "particularly when those histories involve people who have since left and cannot speak for themselves." Mrs. Bantry mentioned that he and my aunt had been engaged. She said it had ended by mutual agreement due to incompatibility. Lucy's tone suggested she found this explanation less than satisfactory. But if that were truly the case, why would everyone seem so reluctant to discuss it? Broken engagements aren't uncommon after all. People's affections change, or they discover they don't suit. It hardly seems worth such careful avoidance after all these years. Miss Marple added, another log to the fire, taking her time with the adjustment. "Perhaps the circumstances of the ending were more complicated than the official explanation suggests. That's what I've begun to suspect." Lucy leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped in her lap. "I found something else among my aunt's papers, a letter written to her in 1928. It was from Thomas Avery." She withdrew an envelope from her handbag and held it for a moment, as though uncertain whether to proceed. Miss Marple waited, recognising that silence often encouraged confession more effectively than questions. "It was in a drawer of her writing desk," Lucy continued, tucked inside a book of poetry. The letter itself was quite brief. He wrote that he understood why things had to end the way they did, and that he hoped she would find the happiness she deserved. But the tone of it, Miss Marple, it didn't sound like a man who had mutually agreed to part. It sounded like someone who had been asked to leave and was trying very hard to be gracious about it. "May I see it?" Miss Marple asked. Lucy handed over the envelope with visible relief. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, and the handwriting was firm and clear, suggesting a writer accustomed to correspondence. Miss Marple read it through carefully, noting not only what was said but what was conspicuously avoided. The letter spoke of understanding and acceptance, of respect for Eleanor's family, and recognition that some obstacles could not be overcome. But there was no mention of incompatibility, no suggestion that the writer's own feelings had changed. Instead, there was a quality of resignation that suggested a decision imposed rather than reached. He loved her, Lucy said quietly. You can feel it in the way he writes, even when he's trying to be formal and proper about the whole thing. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, returning the letter. And she kept this letter for the rest of her life, which suggests her own feelings were rather more durable than one might have expected from a relationship that ended due to mere incompatibility. Lucy tucked the letter back into her handbag. I've been trying to understand what could have caused such an abrupt ending. Mrs. Bantry mentioned a scandal involving another family member, but she claimed not to know the details. Do you think that's true? Mrs. Bantry knows a great deal about most things that happen in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple said. Whether she knows the full truth of this particular matter, I couldn't say, but I suspect she knows more than she revealed to me. I don't wish to cause trouble or stir up old resentments, Lucy said earnestly, but I find I can't simply accept the tidy explanation I've always been given. My aunt lived her entire life in this village, apparently content, apparently at peace, but she kept that album wrapped away where no one would see it, and she kept that letter hidden in her desk. Those don't seem like the actions of someone who had simply moved on from a youthful romance. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles finding their rhythm. Your aunt strikes me as someone who learned to accommodate disappointment with considerable grace. But accommodation is not the same as forgetting, and grace can sometimes require a great deal of effort to maintain. The album ends so abruptly, Lucy said. After her wedding to Mr. Pritchard, there are perhaps 6 photographs, all from the first year or two of their marriage. And then nothing, just empty pages waiting for a life that was never recorded. Perhaps, Miss Marple suggested, she found she no longer wished to preserve that particular life, or perhaps she felt that the album belonged to a different person entirely, someone who had existed before certain choices were made. Lucy was silent for a moment, gazing into the fire. I wish I'd asked her about it when she was alive, but children don't think to ask their elders about such things, do they? We assume we'll always have time, and then suddenly we don't. It's a common regret, Miss Marple said kindly, though I wonder if your aunt would have told you the truth even if you had asked. Some people carry their secrets because they have learned that sharing them only causes pain. But to whom? That's what I can't understand. Everyone involved is long gone now. Thomas Avery left England decades ago. My aunt has passed. Mr. Pritchard died years before her. Who could possibly be hurt by the truth at this point? It was a reasonable question, and Miss Marple considered it carefully. In her experience, old secrets were often protected, not because they might harm those directly involved, but because they might alter how those people were remembered. A village had its established narratives, its agreed-upon versions of who had been worthy and who had not, who had behaved well and who had caused trouble. To disturb those narratives was to suggest that the village's judgment might have been flawed, its moral certainties less certain than it preferred to believe. The truth can be inconvenient, she said at last, even when it harms no one directly. It can force people to reconsider conclusions they reached long ago, or to acknowledge that their treatment of others might not have been entirely fair. Lucy nodded slowly. You think the village knows more than they're willing to say. I think the village has constructed a version of events that allows everyone to feel they behave properly. Whether that version bears much resemblance to what actually occurred is another matter entirely. The afternoon was drawing toward evening, and Lucy rose to take her leave. As Miss Marple helped her with her coat, the younger woman turned with sudden earnestness. Will you help me understand what really happened? I know it's asking a great deal, and I have no right to impose on your time, but I feel as though I owe it to my aunt to know the truth. She kept that album for a reason, and I don't think it was simply nostalgia for her youth." Miss Marple fastened the top button of her own cardigan, a gesture that bought her a moment to consider her response. She thought of the carefully wrapped album, the preserved letter, the empty pages waiting for photographs that would never be mounted. She thought of a woman who had lived a respectable life while keeping the evidence of another possibility carefully hid, but not destroyed. "I shall be happy to listen and to offer what observations I can," she said, "though I suspect the truth, when we find it, may prove to be both simpler and sadder than you imagine." After Lucy had gone, Miss Marple returned to her chair by the fire. The photograph Lucy had brought sat on the mantelpiece, a record of a single afternoon preserved in silver and paper. She wondered how many other photographs existed, scattered through how many homes, showing moments that had seemed unremarkable at the time, but had proven, in retrospect, to be the last instances of something that would not come again. The album had been brought down from its cupboard, and with it had come questions that St. Mary Mead would much prefer to leave unasked. But questions, once raised, had a way of insisting on answers, whether those answers were welcome or not. Outside, darkness had settled over the village, and the first stars were appearing in the clear November sky. Chapter 5, What the Photographs Did Not Show. The village, having satisfied its initial curiosity about the album and paid its respects to the deceased, appeared content to let the matter rest. Miss Marple observed this collective retreat from inquiry with interest. In her experience, such determined incuriosity often indicated that people knew precisely what questions ought not to be asked. She encountered Colonel Wexford outside the greengrocer's on a morning when frost had settled on the hedgerows and made the air sharp enough to sting. The Colonel, who had served in India and affected to find English weather insufferably mild, was nevertheless wrapped in a substantial overcoat and looked rather less robust than his manner suggested. "Terrible business about Mrs. Pritchard," he said, though his tone implied the business was not terrible so much as regrettable in a general way. "Still, she had a good innings. Can't ask for much more than that." Miss Marple, who privately thought one might ask for rather more than a life of quiet resignation, murmured an appropriate agreement. "The niece is still about, I understand," the Colonel continued. "Going through the house. Takes time, that sort of thing. My sister was 6 months sorting out our mother's effects." "Miss Pritchard has been very thorough," Miss Marple said. She mentioned finding several items of interest among her aunt's papers. The Colonel's expression underwent a subtle alteration, becoming slightly more guarded. "Did she indeed? Well, I expect there's always more in these old houses than one anticipates. Letters and such. People kept everything in those days." "Yes, they did," Miss Marple agreed. "I suppose one never knows what might prove significant later." "Quite so. Though sometimes it's better not to go digging too deeply into the past. What's done is done after all. No sense in unsettling people with ancient history." He touched his hat and moved away with what seemed to miss Marple in unseemly haste, leaving her to reflect that his concern about unsettling the people was itself rather unsettling. She purchased her vegetables and returned home to find Miss Debenham waiting on her doorstep, an unusual circumstance, given that the post office proprietress rarely left her domain during business hours. "I hope you don't mind my calling," Miss Debenham said, "but I wanted a word in private, and the post office is hardly the place for confidential conversation." Miss Marple ushered her inside and provided tea, noting that her visitor's hands trembled slightly as she lifted the cup. Miss Debenham was a woman of 60 or thereabouts, spinsterish in the way of women who had lost their prospects to the Great War and had made themselves useful in its aftermath. She knew everyone's business because everyone's business passed through her hands in one form or another, and she had learned to be both discreet and selective in what she chose to remember. "It's about the album," Miss Debenham said without preamble. "I've been thinking about it rather a lot since the tea, particularly about those photographs of Thomas Avery." "They seem to prompt considerable interest," Miss Marple observed. "Interest and discomfort in equal measure." Miss Debenham set down her cup. "I was very close to Eleanor Pritchard in those days, you see." We were much of an age, and my sister and I were often included in the same gatherings. I knew Thomas Avery quite well, or as well as anyone did. He was well liked, I gather. He was charming in an unassuming way. Nothing calculated about it, just a natural pleasantness that put people at ease. Eleanor was very taken with him, though she tried to hide it at first. Her family wouldn't have approved, you understand. The Pritchards were rather proud of their lineage. Miss Debenham paused, choosing her words carefully. When the engagement was announced, some people claimed to be shocked, but I wasn't. Anyone who'd watched them together could see how it would end. They were perfectly suited in temperament, if not in social standing. But the engagement ended, Miss Marple said, rather dramatically. 1 week they were planning their future, and the next Thomas had left for Canada. The story put about was incompatibility, but that was nonsense. They were utterly devoted to each other. Then why did he leave? Miss Debenham's hands tightened around her cup. There was an incident involving Eleanor's younger brother Geoffrey. He'd been working in London, something in finance, and had gotten himself into difficulties. Gambling debts, or so it was whispered, though the family denied it vigorously. She glanced at Miss Marple as though assessing how much to reveal. Geoffrey came home in disgrace. There was talk of prosecution, though nothing came of it in the end. The family managed to settle matters quietly, but it required every connection they had and a substantial amount of money. And Mr. Avery's departure was connected to this. Geoffrey claimed that Thomas had encouraged his gambling, had introduced him to the men who'd taken advantage of him. It was a complete fabrication, of course. Thomas barely knew Geoffrey, but the family believed it, or chose to believe it. They needed someone to blame besides their own son. Miss Debenham's voice had grown bitter. They told Eleanor that if she married Thomas, she would be cutting herself off from the family entirely. No support, no acknowledgement, nothing. And more than that, they suggested that Thomas himself was not to be trusted, that his interest in Eleanor had been mercenary all along. A cruel suggestion, Miss Marple said quietly. Devastatingly so. Eleanor was caught between loyalty to her family and her feelings for Thomas. In the end, she chose family. She asked Thomas to leave, to spare them both further pain, and he went, because he loved her enough to do what she asked. Did she ever learn the truth about her brother's accusations? I tried to tell her. I knew Geoffrey had lied, that he had named Thomas simply because Thomas wasn't there to defend himself and because the family was already predisposed to believe ill of him, but Eleanor wouldn't listen. Or perhaps she couldn't. By then she'd made her choice, and admitting Geoffrey had lied would have meant admitting she'd sacrificed her happiness for nothing. Miss Debenham rose and walked to the window, her back to Miss Marple. She married Arthur Pritchard 5 years later. A good man, solid and dependable. But she never looked at him the way she'd looked at Thomas. I used to think that was the cruelest part of it all. She'd given up what she wanted and gotten only adequacy in return. Did Mr. Avery ever know why the engagement truly ended? I don't believe so. He must have thought Eleanor had simply bowed to family pressure, that her attachment to him hadn't been strong enough to overcome her fear of losing her position. I doubt he ever knew Geoffrey had actively slandered him. She returned to her seat, her expression weary. I've kept this to myself for nearly 30 years. But seeing those photographs again, seeing Thomas's face in them, I found I couldn't maintain the silence any longer. Lucy deserves to know what her aunt gave up and why. Have you told Miss Pritchard any of this? Not yet. I wanted to speak with you first to see if you thought I was right to do so. Some people would say it's better to let the dead keep their secrets. But I keep thinking about Eleanor, keeping that album wrapped away all those years. She preserved those photographs for a reason, Miss Marple. Perhaps she wanted someone eventually to understand. Miss Marple considered this carefully. The truth can be painful, but I've generally found that people prefer it to comfortable lies. Miss Pritchard strikes me as someone who would want to know, even if the knowing brings sorrow. Then I shall tell her. Miss Debenham gathered her things to leave. Though I confess I'm not looking forward to it. It's not pleasant to admit one's own cowardice. I knew the truth about Geoffrey's lies, and I said nothing when it might have mattered. You tried to tell Mrs. Pritchard, Miss Marple said gently. I tried once, and when she refused to listen, I didn't try again. That's not quite the same as doing everything one could, is it?" After Miss Debenham had gone, Miss Marple sat for a long while in her chair, thinking about the photographs that had prompted such careful remembering. The album showed Thomas Avery standing among people who had ultimately chosen to believe the worst of him. It showed Eleanor Pritchard, young and hopeful, before duty had required her to arrange her life around other people's lies. But what the photographs did not show was perhaps more revealing than what they captured. They did not show Geoffrey Pritchard's desperate fabrications or the family's eagerness to accept them. They did not show Eleanor's struggle or Thomas's wounded departure. They did not show the long years that followed, when Eleanor had lived her respectable life while keeping the evidence of what she had lost, wrapped carefully and stored away. The album, Miss Marple reflected, was like memory itself. It preserved certain moments with perfect clarity while leaving vast stretches of experience undocumented. And in those gaps between images lay the truths that people found most difficult to acknowledge. She thought of Lucy, sorting through her aunt's effects and finding a letter that didn't quite match the story she'd been told. It took courage to pursue truth when everyone around you insisted you should be satisfied with comfortable fiction. But then Miss Marple had always believed that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to proceed despite it. The afternoon light was fading. She lit the lamp beside her chair and returned to her knitting, but her mind remained occupied with photographs and the stories they failed to tell. Chapter 6. A story too neat to be true. True. November deepened into that stretch of days when the year seems to pause before committing fully to winter. The village settled into its routines with the quiet persistence that comes from long practice, and to the casual observer, St. Mary Mead might have appeared unchanged by the small disturbance that had followed Mrs. Pritchard's death. But Miss Marple, who was rarely a casual observer, noted the subtle shifts in behaviour that suggested the album had left its mark. Conversations at the butcher's stopped when certain people entered. Mrs. Bantry had taken to crossing the street rather than encounter Miss Debenham directly. And Lucy Pritchard, when Miss Marple encountered her at the lending library, had the look of someone carrying knowledge they were not quite certain what to do with. It was 2 days after Miss Debenham's visit that Lucy appeared at Miss Marple's door, her expression troubled. She had spoken with Miss Debenham, she explained, and had been told the truth about Geoffrey's lies and Thomas's forced departure. The revelation had unsettled her considerably, though not in the way Miss Marple might have expected. "It should be simple, shouldn't it?" Lucy said, accepting tea and settling into the chair that was becoming familiar to her. "A lie was told, an innocent man was blamed, and my aunt was forced to give up her happiness. That's the tragedy, complete and comprehensible." "But you find it isn't quite so simple," Miss Marple suggested. "No, because I've been thinking about the story itself, the way it's been presented to me, and the more I consider it, the less convincing it becomes." She withdrew a small notebook from her handbag, the sort with a leather cover and gilt-edged pages. "I've been writing down everything I've been told, trying to arrange it into a coherent narrative. Mrs. Bantry said there was a scandal involving a family member. Miss Debenham said it was Geoffrey, and that he falsely accused Thomas to deflect blame for his own gambling debts. That seems consistent," Miss Marple observed. "On the surface, yes. But then I started asking myself questions that no one seems to have considered. If Geoffrey was in such desperate straits that he needed his family's intervention, why wasn't he prosecuted? Mrs. Bantry suggested the family used their connections to settle matters quietly, but that requires rather extraordinary influence, doesn't it? The Pritchards were respected, certainly, but they weren't powerfully connected. My great-grandfather was a country solicitor, not a magistrate or a member of Parliament." Miss Marple's needles paused briefly. It was an astute observation, one that suggested Lucy possessed more analytical capacity than her apologetic manner implied. "And there's another difficulty," Lucy continued. "If Geoffrey was so clearly lying about Thomas's involvement, why did the family believe him? Miss Debenham said Thomas barely knew, Geoffrey, that they moved in entirely different circles, Wouldn't Eleanor have known that? Wouldn't she have questioned her brother's accusations? People under pressure often believe what they wish to believe, Miss Marple said carefully, or what makes their situation more bearable. Perhaps, but I keep returning to the fact that Eleanor asked Thomas to leave. Not her family, not her parents, Eleanor herself. That suggests she had her own reasons, beyond simply capitulating to family pressure. Lucy opened her notebook and traced a finger down her notes. I went back to the album yesterday. I looked at all the photographs showing Geoffrey, trying to understand him better. There aren't many. He appears in perhaps half a dozen images, always at formal family gatherings, and in every single one he's standing next to Thomas. Is he indeed? Miss Marple murmured. Not just near him, but deliberately positioned beside him. In one photograph, Geoffrey has his arm around Thomas's shoulders. In another, they're sharing what appears to be a private joke. These aren't the photographs of distant acquaintances, Miss Marple. There are images of close friends. The fire crackled softly in the grate. Outside, a few dry leaves skittered across the garden path, pursuing each other in endless circles. So Miss Debenham was either mistaken about the nature of their relationship, Lucy said slowly, or she was not telling me the complete truth. Or, Miss Marple suggested, the story she told you was the story she herself was told and believed without examining it too closely. You think she's been deceived as well? I think that when something painful happens, people construct explanations that allow them to assign clear blame and move forward. Geoffrey was young, reckless, and in trouble. Thomas was an outsider who had presumed above his station. It would be natural to cast Geoffrey as the villain who lied, and Thomas as the innocent victim who suffered. That narrative is emotionally satisfying because it has clear heroes and villains. Lucy closed her notebook with a soft snap. But life isn't usually so clear, is it? Very rarely, Miss Marple agreed. More often, everyone involved makes choices that seem reasonable at the time, but prove unfortunate in retrospect. And the people who come after construct tidy explanations because the messy truth is too uncomfortable to acknowledge. Then what do you think actually happened? Miss Marple set down her knitting and folded her hands in her lap. I think we should begin by questioning what we've been told. You're quite right that the story is too neat. Geoffrey lies, Thomas is blamed, Eleanor is pressured, and everyone lives unhappily ever after. But if Thomas and Geoffrey were actually friends, as the photographs suggest, then the story becomes more complicated. How so? Consider the possibility that Geoffrey wasn't lying about Thomas's involvement, not in the way Miss Debenham suggests, perhaps. But suppose Thomas was present when Geoffrey made his poor decisions. Perhaps he even tried to help Geoffrey, lent him money, or attempted to intervene with the creditors. That would explain why Geoffrey mentioned Thomas's name, not as a malicious deflection, but as a truthful accounting of who had been involved in the situation. Lucy's cursed expression grew more troubled. But then why would the family blame Thomas so completely? Because acknowledging Thomas's well-intentioned involvement would mean acknowledging that Geoffrey had dragged his friend into his difficulties. It would make Geoffrey's behaviour seem even more irresponsible. Much simpler to pretend Thomas had been the corrupting influence, particularly if they already disapproved of Eleanor's attachment to him. And Eleanor would have known the truth, Lucy said quietly. She would have known that Thomas hadn't corrupted Geoffrey, but that Geoffrey had compromised Thomas's reputation by involving him in his troubles, which would give her a very different reason for asking Thomas to leave, not because she believed he was guilty, but because she knew his continued presence would mean his name and would always be associated with her brother's scandal. Sending him away might have been an act of protection rather than capitulation. Lucy rose and moved to the window, much as Miss Debenham had done days earlier. That's somehow sadder than thinking she simply abandoned him for her family's sake. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, because it means she sacrificed her own happiness in an attempt to preserve his reputation, even though that attempt was ultimately futile. The village remembers him as the man who left under a cloud, regardless of what Eleanor intended. The letter Thomas wrote to her, Lucy said, turning back to face the room. He said he understood why things had to end. That sounds like someone who recognized what Eleanor was trying to do, doesn't it? He wasn't confused or hurt by being abandoned. He understood the choice she'd made and why she'd made it. It does suggest a more complex understanding between them than a simple ending would require. Lucy returned to her chair, her movements slow with thought. I spoke with Colonel Wexford this morning. He became quite agitated when I mentioned I'd been looking through the album again. He said some things were better left in the past, that dredging up old stories served no useful purpose. But then he said something curious. He said that Eleanor had done what any decent woman would have done, putting others before herself. As though he knew the specifics of what she'd given up and why, Miss Marple said. Exactly. And when I pressed him, he claimed he'd only meant in a general sense, that she'd made a good marriage and fulfilled her duties. But his manner suggested he knew rather more than that. The Colonel was part of that same social circle in the late 20s, Miss Marple observed. He would have been aware of the situation as it developed. And military men often pride themselves on loyalty to those they consider their own. He may well have supported the family's version of events out of a sense of solidarity, which means he knows the truth but won't share it, or knows a version of the truth that confirms his view of how things ought to be remembered. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the needles clicking with their steady rhythm. In my experience, people rarely lie outright about the past, but they shape it, emphasize certain elements while minimizing others, until what they remember is perfectly tailored to support their understanding of themselves as honourable and their judgments as sound. Lucy was quiet for a moment, watching the play of firelight against the walls. So the story I've been told is both true and false. Geoffrey did involve Thomas in his troubles, but not through corruption. Thomas did leave under difficult circumstances, but not because he'd done anything wrong. And Eleanor did choose her family over her attachment, but only because she was trying to protect Thomas from further damage. That would be my supposition, Miss Marple said, though I suspect there are still details we haven't uncovered. The question is whether those details would change our understanding in any significant way. Does it matter? They're all gone now. Geoffrey, Thomas, Eleanor, Mr. Pritchard. The truth can't help any of them. No, Miss Marple agreed. But it might help you understand your aunt better, and it might allow the album to be what I suspect she always intended it to be. A record of something genuine that was lost, kept not as a shrine to bitterness, but as a reminder that love, even when it ends sadly, is still worth preserving. Lucy gathered her things to leave, but paused at the door. Thank you, Miss Marple. You've helped me see that perhaps I was looking for the wrong kind of truth. Not a simple story with clear villains, but something more human and therefore more painful. After she had gone, Miss Marple returned to her knitting and thought about stories that were too neat to be true. In her experience, real life was messy and contradictory, filled with good intentions that produced unfortunate results and sacrifices that no one fully appreciated. The village's tidy explanation had the virtue of clarity, but it missed entirely the sadness at the heart of Eleanor Pritchard's preserved photographs. Better, Miss Marple thought, to accept complexity than to insist on simplicity that did violence to the truth. Outside, the afternoon continued its slow fade toward evening, patient and inevitable as the turning year. Chapter 7. The Kindness That Required Silence. The revelation that Thomas and Geoffrey had been friends rather than strangers changed the character of the inquiry without quite resolving it. Miss Marple found herself thinking about the photographs with renewed attention, particularly those showing the two young men together. There was an ease in their postures that suggested genuine affection, the sort of comfort that comes from shared experience rather than social obligation. She was considering this one morning when Mrs. Bantry called, unannounced and looking rather flustered. This was sufficiently unusual that Miss Marple set aside her knitting immediately and gave her visitor her full attention. "I've had the most extraordinary conversation with Miss Debenham," Mrs. Bantry announced, settling herself without waiting for an invitation. "She came to see me yesterday evening, quite late, and said she needed to correct something she'd told Lucy Pritchard." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, reaching for the teapot. She admitted she'd been wrong about Thomas and Geoffrey barely knowing each other, said she'd forgotten they'd actually been quite close at one time before the trouble started. But she insisted that made Geoffrey's behaviour even worse, betraying a friend like that. Mrs. Bantry accepted her tea with hands that trembled slightly. The thing is, Miss Marple, I don't believe she'd forgotten at all. I think she remembered perfectly well, but chose to present the situation in a way that made Thomas seem entirely blameless. To protect his memory, Miss Marple suggested, or to make the story simpler than it actually was, because if Thomas and Geoffrey were friends, then Thomas must have known about Geoffrey's difficulties, and if he knew, then the question becomes what he did about it. Miss Marple poured her own tea with careful precision. And what did Miss Debenham say he'd done? That's just it. She became very vague, said she didn't know the details, that these things had been kept quiet at the time, but her manner suggested she knew more than she was willing to say. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, lowering her voice though they were quite alone. So I told her something I've never told anyone, about a conversation I overheard, completely by accident, about a week before Thomas left the village. Go on, Miss Marple said quietly. I was at the Pritchard house, attending some committee meeting or other. I'd gone upstairs to fetch my gloves from the spare room where we'd left our things, and as I passed Eleanor's sitting room, I heard voices, Eleanor and Thomas, speaking very quietly but with considerable intensity. Mrs. Bantry paused, her expression troubled by the memory. I know I should have moved away immediately, but I was startled by Thomas's presence. It was considered quite improper for them to be alone together, even engaged as they were, and something in their tones made me hesitate. What did you hear? Thomas was saying that he would take full responsibility, that Geoffrey shouldn't have to bear the consequences alone. Eleanor was arguing with him, saying it would ruin him, that the association would follow him forever. And Thomas said... Mrs. Bantry's voice faltered slightly. He said that he couldn't stand by and watch Geoffrey destroyed when he'd have been part of what happened. Miss Marple set down her cup with great care. Part of what happened, not the cause of it, but a participant. Yes, exactly. Eleanor kept saying it wasn't his fault, that he'd only been trying to help, but Thomas insisted that he'd failed Geoffrey somehow, that his help hadn't been sufficient or wise, and now he had to face the consequences of that failure. And what did Mrs. Pritchard say to that? She said something I've never forgotten. She said, if you insist on this terrible nobility, you'll destroy both our futures. But if you'll let me protect you, at least one of us might still have a life worth living. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with 30 years of silence. Mrs. Bantry's eyes had grown bright with unshed tears. I left then, as quietly as I'd come, and 3 days later Thomas was gone. The story about incompatibility was put about, and everyone pretended to believe it. But I knew what had really happened. Eleanor had sent him away to save him from his own sense of honour. Did you ever speak to her about what you'd heard? I couldn't. How does one acknowledge having overheard such a private moment? And besides, what could I have said that would have changed anything? The decision had been made. Eleanor had chosen sacrifice over honesty, and Thomas had accepted her choice because he loved her enough to let her make it. Mrs. Bantry withdrew a handkerchief and dabbed at her eyes. I told myself for years that she'd done the right thing, that Thomas had gone on to have a good life elsewhere, free from the taint of scandal, but seeing that album, seeing how carefully she'd preserved those photographs, I began to wonder if the sacrifice had been worth what it cost. You've carried this knowledge alone all these years, Miss Marple said gently. I thought it was the kind thing to do. Eleanor had made her choice, and it seemed cruel to suggest she had been wrong to make it. But now she's gone, and Lucy is trying to understand her aunt's life, and I find that keeping silent feels less like kindness and more like cowardice. Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the garden, where the last chrysanthemums were fading into brown. The difficulty with silence is that it often seems like the gentle option. We tell ourselves we're protecting people from painful truths, but Sometimes silence simply allows people to construct narratives that are easier to live with than the reality would have been. Do you think I should tell Lucy what I heard? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that Lucy has already grasped the essential truth. She understands that her aunt acted out of love rather than weakness. What you overheard confirms that understanding and provides the emotional context for it. She turned back to face Mrs. Bantry. But there's still something we haven't addressed. You said Thomas spoke of failing Geoffrey, of his help not being sufficient. That suggests Thomas did try to intervene in some way. Do you know what form that intervention took? Mrs. Bantry shook her head. I've wondered about that for years. Geoffrey's troubles were described as gambling debts, but I've sometimes thought there might have been more to it than that. Gambling debts are sordid but not unusual among young men of that class. They wouldn't typically require someone to leave the country to escape the association. Unless the debts were incurred in a particularly scandalous context, Miss Marple suggested. Or unless the methods used to address them raised questions about the character of those involved. You think Thomas lent Geoffrey money? Or helped him secure it from less reputable sources? Or perhaps simply knew about the full extent of Geoffrey's difficulties and failed to alert the family in time to prevent disaster? Any of those things might explain why Thomas felt responsible without actually being culpable. Mrs. Bantry considered this, and Eleanor would have known that Thomas's only crime was loyalty to a friend who didn't deserve it, which would make her decision to send him away both selfless and pragmatic. If Geoffrey's reputation was already damaged, allowing Thomas to share that damage would accomplish nothing except to ruin 2 lives instead of 1. But it did ruin 2 lives, Mrs. Bantry said quietly, just in a different way than it might have done. Miss Marple returned to her chair. Perhaps, though I think we must be careful about assuming we know what constitutes ruin. Mrs. Pritchard lived a respectable life, contributed to her community, and maintained her dignity throughout. That may not have been the life she would have chosen, but it was not without value. And Thomas! We know very little about his subsequent life, which may be significant in itself. If he had been desperately unhappy, one imagines he might have returned eventually, or attempted to contact Eleanor. His continued absence suggests he built something for himself elsewhere. A thin comfort, Mrs. Bantry said. Yes, but comfort nonetheless. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, 2 elderly women contemplating the various ways people found to endure disappointment. Miss Marple thought about Eleanor Pritchard, wrapping the album carefully and storing it high in a cupboard, preserving evidence of what she'd lost while simultaneously removing it from daily view. It was, she reflected, an almost perfect metaphor for how one might live with irrevocable choice, acknowledging the reality of it while refusing to be consumed by regret. Mrs. Bantry rose to leave, gathering her things with the deliberate movements of someone who has unburdened themselves and found the relief less complete than hoped for. Will you speak with Lucy? Miss Marple asked. I think I must, though I dread seeing her face when she realizes how many people knew parts of the truth and said nothing. She may surprise you. Young people are often more resilient about these matters than we expect, and she strikes me as someone who values honesty even when it's painful. After Mrs. Bantry had departed, Miss Marple sat for some time with her knitting idle in her lap. She thought about the various forms kindness could take, and how often the kindness that seemed most gentle in the moment proved to be the most complicated over time. Silence had protected Eleanor Pritchard from having to defend her choices, but it had also isolated her with those choices in ways that might not have been entirely healthy. The album had been a secret kept by everyone who saw it, even as it was allegedly shared at the condolence tea. People had looked at the photographs and understood their significance, but had agreed, tacitly and without discussion, not to speak of what they understood. That too had been a kind of kindness, the kindness that required complicity and rewarded conformity. But kindness, Miss Marple had long believed, ought to serve the person receiving it rather than the people offering it, and she was not entirely convinced that the village's collective silence had served Eleanor Pritchard as well as it had served the village's sense of its own discretion. The afternoon darkened toward evening. Miss Marple lit her lamp and resumed her knitting, but her thoughts remained occupied with photographs and silences, and the various prices people paid for the privilege of being left alone with their losses. Chapter 8. The page that had been removed. The weather had turned decisively toward winter. A hard frost settled over St. Mary Mead each night, and the mornings required considerable resolve to leave the warmth of indoors. Miss Marple, who had always maintained that one's comfort should not dictate one's activities, continued her daily routine with only slight concessions to the cold. It was during one of these morning walks that she encountered Lucy Pritchard near the church gate. The younger woman looked rather pale, though whether from the cold or from recent discoveries Miss Marple could not immediately determine. "I was hoping I might see you," Lucy said. "Mrs. Bantry came to call yesterday. She told me about the conversation she'd overheard." "That must have been rather overwhelming," Miss Marple said. "In a way, but it also clarified something that had been puzzling me." Lucy fell into step beside Miss Marple as they walked slowly along the lane. "I'd been wondering why Aunt Eleanor stopped adding to the album so abruptly. It seemed such an incomplete gesture to preserve all those memories and then simply abandon the project. But if she had made the decision to send Thomas away, continuing to document her life afterward might have felt like a kind of betrayal." "Of what she'd given up," Miss Marple suggested, "or of what she'd preserved in those earlier pages. The album became a record of a particular time, a specific possibility. Continuing it would have meant acknowledging that life had gone on without what mattered most." They walked in silence for a moment, their breath visible in the cold air. Lucy drew her coat more tightly around herself. "There's something else I wanted to ask you about," she said. "I've been examining the album more carefully, and I noticed something peculiar. There's a page that's been removed. You can see where it was cut out quite carefully, leaving only the slightest stub where it was attached to the binding. Do you know which photographs it contained?" "I think I do. I found the negatives in a drawer of Aunt Eleanor's writing desk tucked inside an envelope marked with a date. August 1928. That would have been just after the engagement was announced, and about 2 months before Thomas left." Lucy withdrew a small packet from her coat pocket. "I had prints made from the negatives yesterday. I thought you might like to see them." They had reached Miss Marple's cottage. She invited Lucy inside and they settled by the fire, while Lucy carefully unwrapped the photographs. There were 3 of them, all showing the same scene from different angles. The setting was clearly a garden party, similar to others that appeared throughout the album, but these images had a quality of intimacy that the earlier photographs lacked. In the first, Eleanor and Thomas sat together on a garden bench, their shoulders touching, their faces turned toward each other in conversation. Eleanor's expression was unguarded in a way Miss Marple had not seen in any other photograph, genuinely happy, without the reserve that had characterized her even in youth. The second photograph showed them standing together near a rose arbor. Thomas's hand rested lightly on Eleanor's arm, and she was laughing at something he'd said. The connection between them was evident even in the stillness of the image. But it was the third photograph that arrested Miss Marple's attention. Eleanor and Thomas stood with Geoffrey, the 3 of them arranged in an easy triangle. Geoffrey had one arm around Thomas's shoulders and was grinning broadly at the camera. Thomas looked slightly embarrassed but pleased, while Eleanor watched both of them with an expression that combined affection and something else, perhaps a kind of wistfulness, as though she recognized even then that this particular configuration of happiness could not last. "They were genuinely friends," Lucy said quietly. "All 3 of them, you can see it in how comfortable they are with each other." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "These are not the photographs of people performing friendship for the camera. This is actual intimacy, captured unawares. I think Aunt Eleanor removed this page herself, years after the engagement ended, not because she wanted to forget, but because seeing these particular images became too painful. Or because they revealed too much about what had actually existed between the 3 of them," Miss Marple suggested. "The album as it stood could be dismissed as youthful nostalgia, but these photographs show something more significant, genuine connection, real happiness, The kind of bond that doesn't simply end because circumstances require it. Lucy gathered the photographs carefully. Mrs. Bantry said that Aunt Eleanor spoke of protecting Thomas, of ensuring at least one of them might have a life worth living. But looking at these images, I wonder if she ever achieved that herself. She married Mr. Pritchard. She fulfilled her duties. She maintained her position in the village. But did she ever laugh like this again? It was not a question that required answering, and Miss Marple did not attempt to provide one. Instead, she rose and fetched the photograph Lucy had given her several days earlier, the image of the church fete showing Miss Marple herself among the crowd. "Look at your aunt in this photograph," she said, pointing to a figure standing near the tea tent. "This was taken perhaps 5 years before her death. What do you see?" Lucy examined the image closely. She looks composed, pleasant, properly dressed and perfectly appropriate for the occasion. "But not happy," Miss Marple said gently. "Not laughing, not unguarded, not connected to those around her in any particularly meaningful way. She looks like someone who has learned to occupy space without drawing attention to the vacancy within it." "That's terribly odd." "It is, though I suspect your aunt would have objected to being pitied. She made her choices with clear understanding of their cost, and she bore that cost with considerable dignity. But dignity and happiness are not the same thing, however often we pretend otherwise." Lucy returned the photographs to their envelope. "I keep thinking about that conversation Mrs. Bantry overheard. Aunt Eleanor said that if Thomas insisted on his terrible nobility, he would destroy both their futures, but by sending him away to protect him, she destroyed their futures anyway, just more slowly and with better intentions." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "though we should be careful about assuming we understand what destruction looks like from a distance of 30 years. Your aunt built a life here, contributed to this community, and maintained relationships that evidently brought her some satisfaction. That may not have been the life she wanted most, but neither was it necessarily a life devoid of meaning." "But the album suggests otherwise. Why keep it at all if she truly made peace with her choices? Why preserve those photographs so carefully, only to hide them away where no one would see them?" Miss Marple resumed her knitting, considering the question. "I think perhaps the album served a different purpose than we've been assuming. We've been treating it as evidence of what was lost, a shrine to disappointed hope. But suppose it was something more practical than that." "How do you mean?" "Your aunt stopped adding to the album after her marriage, yes? But she didn't destroy it. She didn't throw away the photographs or burn them in a fit of dramatic renunciation. She wrapped them carefully, stored them safely, and preserved them for decades. That suggests to me not someone who couldn't let go, but someone who chose deliberately to remember." Lucy frowned slightly, following the thread of this reasoning. "You think she wanted to preserve an accurate record of what had happened?" "I think she wanted to preserve the truth of what she'd felt and what she'd lost, precisely because the village was so determined to reshape that truth into something more comfortable. Everyone else could pretend the engagement had ended due to incompatibility, that Thomas had been an unsuitable match, that Eleanor's marriage to Mr. Pritchard represented a fortunate escape, but the photographs proved otherwise." "They were her private rebellion," Lucy said slowly. "Her way of insisting that what she'd experienced had been real and valuable, even if circumstances had prevented it from continuing. And perhaps her way of ensuring that someone, eventually, would understand what she'd given up and why. She couldn't speak of it during her lifetime without causing exactly the sort of painful exposure she'd sacrificed so much to prevent. But by preserving the album, she created the possibility that someday, after everyone involved was beyond the reach of scandal or hurt, the truth might be recognized." Lucy was quiet for a long moment, gazing into the fire. "I found something else in her desk," she said finally. A note written in her hand and dated just 2 years ago. It said, "To whoever finds this album, please know that these photographs show people who loved each other and tried to do right by one another. If we failed, it was the failure of courage, not of affection." "She knew the album would be discovered after her death," Miss Marple said. "Yes, and she wanted whoever found it to understand that the story the village told wasn't the whole truth. She couldn't correct that story herself, but she could at least leave evidence for someone else to use. "Which you have done," Miss Marple observed. "You've questioned the comfortable narratives, pursued the truth despite people's reluctance to discuss it, and arrived at an understanding of your aunt's life that honours both her sacrifice and her grief." Lucy rose to leave, tucking the photographs back into her coat pocket. "I've decided to restore the missing page to the album. I'll have these photographs printed properly and mounted where they should have been all along. Aunt Eleanor removed them because she found them too painful to look at regularly, but I don't think she would have objected to their eventual restoration." "I think that's very wise," Miss Marple said. "The album should be complete again, if only to acknowledge that what your aunt experienced was complete in itself, even though circumstances prevented it from continuing." After Lucy had departed, Miss Marple sat for some time looking at the photograph of the church fete. She found Eleanor Pritchard's figure again, properly dressed, pleasantly smiling, and profoundly alone despite being surrounded by her neighbours. It was, she reflected, the face of someone who had learned to exist within limitation, to find what small satisfactions were available while acknowledging what had been forever placed beyond reach. The album's missing page had been a kind of mercy Eleanor had granted herself, permission not to be constantly reminded of what three people had briefly achieved together. But it had also been an incompleteness, a gap in the record that suggested the truth could not be fully confronted. By restoring those photographs, Lucy would be completing her aunt's work in a way Eleanor herself could not have done. The album would finally show the full story, not just what had been lost, but what had existed before the losing, and why that existence had mattered enough to preserve despite the pain of preservation. Outside, the winter afternoon drew toward its early close. Miss Marple lit her lamp and continued her knitting, thinking about pages removed and restored, and the various ways people tried to live with choices that could be neither undone nor fully accepted. Chapter 9, The Past Put Back in Order. The days between Lucy's discovery of the missing page and her decision to act upon that discovery passed with the quiet deliberation that characterized much of village life. Miss Marple observed from her window as Lucy made several visits to the photographer's shop and later to the church, where she spent a considerable time in the churchyard examining stones whose inscriptions had long since faded into illegibility. It was during this period that Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Geoffrey Pritchard's widow, Mrs. Helena Pritchard, appeared at her door on a morning when the frost had painted the windows with intricate patterns and the air held the sharp clarity that precedes snow. Mrs. Pritchard was a woman of 75, small and neat, with the kind of careful grooming that suggested she had long ago decided how she wished to present herself, and saw no reason to alter that presentation. She had married Geoffrey late in both their lives, some 15 years after Thomas Avery's departure, and had lived quietly in the village ever since his death, a decade previous. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion," she said as Miss Marple ushered her inside. "But I understand that Lucy has been making inquiries about the family history, and I thought it time someone provided her with information from a less filtered perspective." Miss Marple settled her guest by the fire and provided tea with her usual precision. Mrs. Pritchard accepted the cup with hands that showed only the slightest tremor. "I knew Geoffrey for only the last 20 years of his life," Mrs. Pritchard began. "But during that time he spoke quite openly about his earlier troubles. He was not a man who believed in hiding from his past, though he did believe in learning from it." "That suggests a degree of self-awareness," Miss Marple observed, "more than most people credited him with. The village always saw Geoffrey as the wastrel younger brother, the one who'd brought scandal on the family and then been forgiven too easily. But the truth was rather more nuanced than that." Mrs. Pritchard sipped her tea, gathering her thoughts. "Geoffrey did have gambling debts, that much of the story is accurate, but they weren't incurred through recklessness or vice. He'd been trying to help a colleague who had fallen into difficulties, a man with a wife and children who would have been ruined if certain debts came to light. Geoffrey borrowed money to settle those debts, intending to repay it gradually from his salary." "A generous impulse," Miss Marple said. "A foolish one, as it turned out. The interest on what Geoffrey had borrowed accumulated faster than he could manage, and he found himself trapped. He confided in Thomas, who immediately offered to help. Between them, they managed to secure enough to settle the debts, but the methods they used were irregular. They borrowed from sources that would not have borne scrutiny. Precisely. And when Geoffrey's family learned of the situation, they were horrified not by the gambling debts themselves, which were a convenient fiction, but by the fact that their son had involved himself with the sort of men one did not acknowledge in polite company. Thomas, as the friend who had helped facilitate these arrangements, became inextricably linked with the scandal. Mrs. Pritchard set down her cup with a soft clink. Geoffrey told me that Eleanor had understood exactly what had happened. She'd known that Thomas had acted out of loyalty, that his only crime had been helping a friend who was trying to help someone else. But she'd also recognised that explaining this to the village would require revealing the full circumstances, which would have exposed both Geoffrey's colleague and the irregular nature of the solution Thomas had arranged. So she chose to let Thomas bear the blame silently rather than defend him publicly. Not bear the blame, exactly. She chose to let him leave before any specific blame could be formally attached. The story about incompatibility was her invention, a way of ending the engagement that suggested no wrongdoing on anyone's part. But she knew that Thomas's connection to Geoffrey's troubles would follow him if he remained, that people would speculate and eventually conclude he'd been a corrupting influence. Miss Marple considered this carefully, and Mr. Avery accepted this arrangement. According to Geoffrey, Thomas fought it at first. He wanted to stay and face whatever consequences came, but Eleanor convinced him that leaving was the only way to protect everyone involved, Geoffrey's colleague, Geoffrey himself, and ultimately Eleanor's family's standing. If Thomas stayed and the full story emerged, too many people would be hurt for no constructive purpose. A remarkably selfless decision, Miss Marple said, by all parties involved. Yes and no. Mrs. Pritchard's expression grew more complex. Geoffrey spent the rest of his life wondering if they had made the right choice. He'd been grateful at the time, of course. He'd kept his position, eventually repaid all the debts, and lived to become a respectable member of the community. But he never forgave himself for the price Eleanor and Thomas had paid for his mistakes. Did he remain in contact with Mr. Avery? For a few years, yes. Thomas settled in Canada, established himself in business, and by all accounts did quite well, but the correspondence gradually ceased. Geoffrey thought it was because Thomas found it too painful to maintain the connection, a constant reminder of what had been lost. Mrs. Pritchard leaned forward slightly. What I wanted Lucy to understand is that the album Eleanor kept wasn't a shrine to lost love, though it was certainly that in part. It was also evidence. Geoffrey said Eleanor had told him once that she wanted there to be a record of how things had actually been before the necessary lies necessary reshaped everything. The photographs showed 3 people who had cared for each other and tried to do right by one another, even when doing right required terrible sacrifice. And the page she removed? Geoffrey saw those photographs once, years after Eleanor had cut them from the album. She kept them in her desk, wrapped separately. He said they'd been too painful to look at regularly, not because they reminded her of what she'd lost, but because they showed all 3 of them happy together, before circumstances forced them to hurt each other in the name of protection. Miss Marple rose to add another log to the fire. The morning had grown colder, and the windows rattled slightly in their frames as the wind picked up. "Why have you chosen to share this now?" she asked gently. "Because Lucy deserves to know that her aunt's story isn't a tragedy of weakness or wasted life. Eleanor made an enormously difficult choice with full understanding of its cost. She protected Geoffrey, she protected Thomas, and she protected a man she'd never met, Geoffrey's colleague, all at considerable expense to her own happiness. That's not failure of courage, as she wrote in her note. That's extraordinary courage of a kind the world rarely recognises, because it produces no dramatic victories, only quiet endurance. And Mr. Pritchard, your husband Geoffrey, he carried this knowledge throughout your marriage. He did, and I think it shaped him in ways he might not have fully recognised. He was extraordinarily kind to people in difficulty, always willing to help in ways that cost him more than was strictly wise. He had learned that sometimes the right thing requires sacrifice, and that those who bear that sacrifice deserve honour rather than pity. Mrs. Pritchard rose, gathering her gloves and handbag. "I've written it all down for Lucy, the full account as Geoffrey told it to me. She should have the complete story, not just the fragments people are willing to share in conversation. Will you give this to her when you next see her?" She handed Miss Marple a sealed envelope. "I would deliver it myself, but I find these matters easier when mediated by someone with wisdom and discretion. You've been helping Lucy understand her aunt's life, and I thought you should have the final piece of the puzzle." After Mrs. Pritchard had departed, Miss Marple sat with the sealed envelope in her lap, thinking about the various forms courage could take. The village had remembered Geoffrey as the troublesome brother, Eleanor as the disappointed spinster who had eventually made a sensible marriage, and Thomas as the unsuitable suitor who had been properly dispatched. But the truth had been altogether more complicated and more honourable than the simple narrative suggested. Eleanor had sacrificed her own happiness to protect 3 people, at least one of whom she had never met. Thomas had accepted that sacrifice because he'd understood the impossible position Eleanor occupied, and Geoffrey had spent the remainder of his life trying to be worthy of what they'd both given up for his sake. None of them had achieved conventional happiness, but they had achieved something perhaps more valuable. They had faced an impossible situation and chosen the course that protected the most people at the greatest cost to themselves. That was not the stuff of comfortable village stories, but it was the substance of genuine moral courage. Miss Marple placed the envelope on her writing desk where she would remember to give it to Lucy. Then she returned to her chair and her knitting, reflecting that the album had indeed been cursed, though not in the way the village might have assumed. It had been cursed by truth, by the preservation of evidence that contradicted the comfortable lies everyone had agreed to believe. But curses could also be blessings, if one had the courage to look at them properly. The album had forced Lucy to question the narrative she had been given to seek truth rather than accept convenience, and in doing so it had restored to Eleanor Pritchard something the village had quietly denied her: recognition that her life had been shaped not by weakness or disappointed romanticism, but by an act of extraordinary selflessness that had required her to remain forever silent about its nature. The past was being put back in order, Miss Marple thought. Not the false order of comfortable stories, but the true order of human beings trying to navigate impossible choices with as much integrity as circumstances allowed. It was a harder story to live with than the simple version, but it had the considerable virtue of being accurate. Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall, settling on the frozen ground with the soft insistence of winter claiming its dominion. Miss Marple watched them accumulate, each flake distinct and fragile, but together forming something that would endure until spring permitted their dissolution, rather like the truth, she reflected, fragile in its particulars but remarkably persistent in its refusal to remain permanently buried. Chapter 10. After the album was closed. The snow that had begun falling during Mrs. Helena Pritchard's visit continued intermittently for several days, transforming St. Mary Mead into the sort of scene that appeared on Christmas cards but was considerably less picturesque to navigate. Miss Marple, who had long ago learned the virtue of patience when weather made movement imprudent, occupied herself with indoor tasks and watched the village through her frosted windows. It was nearly a week before Lucy called again, arriving on an afternoon when the sun had finally emerged and begun the slow work of melting what it had taken days to accumulate. She carried with her a parcel wrapped in the same brown paper that had protected the album for so many years. "I've finished," Lucy said simply, settling into the chair that had become hers during these visits. "The album is complete again. I wanted you to see it before I return it to the house." Miss Marple cleared a space on the table, and Lucy unwrapped the album with careful hands. It looked much as it had at the condolence tea, the same cracked leather binding and yellowed pages. But when Lucy opened it to the section from 1928, the missing page had been restored. The 3 photographs Lucy had discovered were mounted properly now, with corner tabs and captions written in a hand that attempted to match Eleanor's careful script. Beneath them, Lucy had added a small notation. Restored by L. Pritchard, November 1957. These photographs were removed by Eleanor Pritchard, but preserved by her throughout her life. They show 3 people who loved each other and tried to do right by one another. "It's beautifully done," Miss Marple said. "I wanted to honour what Aunt Eleanor had intended by preserving them separately, while also completing the record she'd begun. The album should show the full truth, not just the parts she felt able to look at regularly." Lucy turned the pages slowly, pausing at various photographs as though seeing them with new understanding. Mrs. Helena Pritchard's letter explained so much. I'd been thinking of this as a story about thwarted love, but it's actually something more complex. It's about people trying to protect each other in circumstances that made protection impossibly costly. "And succeeding in their way," Miss Marple observed, "however painful that success proved to be. Yes, Geoffrey lived a respectable life and eventually found contentment with Helena. Thomas established himself successfully in Canada, according to what Mrs. Pritchard wrote. And Aunt Eleanor maintained her dignity and contributed meaningfully to this community for 5 decades. Those aren't small achievements, even if they weren't the achievements any of them would have chosen." Lucy closed the album gently. "I've been wondering what to do with it now. Seems wrong to simply put it back in the cupboard where it was hidden. But displaying it openly would invite exactly the sort of speculation Aunt Eleanor spent her life avoiding. What does your instinct suggest? I thought I might donate it to the church archives, with a note explaining that it documents a period of the village's history and should be available to anyone interested in local families. That way it's preserved and accessible, but not sensationalized." Miss Marple considered this. A wise solution. The album becomes a historical document rather than a personal tragedy. And in time, when everyone directly concerned has been long gone, perhaps someone will look at those photographs and simply see 3 young people who cared for each other, without needing to know all the complicated circumstances that surrounded them. That's what I hope, though I'll include Mrs. Pritchard's letter as well, sealed with instructions that it not be opened for 50 years. By then even the memory of scandal will have faded, and the truth can be known without causing pain. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching the winter sunlight move across the room. Miss Marple thought about the various ways truth could be managed, hidden, revealed, delayed or transformed, and how each approach carried its own moral weight. "I've been thinking about something you said," Lucy continued, "about how the album forced people to remember things they'd preferred to forget. The village constructed a comfortable narrative about what happened, and the photographs challenged that narrative simply by existing. The past has a way of resisting our attempts to reshape it," Miss Marple said. "We can choose which parts to emphasize and which to minimize, but we cannot make it into something it fundamentally was not." No. I think that's what Aunt Eleanor understood when she wrapped the album and put it away. She knew she couldn't change what had happened or make it easier to bear, but she could preserve an accurate record so that someday someone might see beyond the comfortable and lies to the harder truth beneath. Lucy rose and moved to the window, much as so many visitors to this room had done during the past weeks. "I'm leaving St. Mary Mead tomorrow. The house is sold, Aunt Eleanor's effects have been distributed or donated, and there's nothing more to keep me here. But I'm grateful for the time I've spent sorting through her life. I understand her so much better now than I did when I arrived." She would have appreciated that, Miss Marple said. Understanding is often the best tribute we can offer those who have gone before us. "Before I leave, I wanted to thank you. You helped me see that pursuing the truth wasn't merely satisfying my own curiosity or disturbing old sorrows for no purpose. You showed me that the truth mattered because the people involved had mattered, and their choices deserved to be recognized for what they actually were." "I did very little," Miss Marple demurred. "You asked the right questions and pursued them with appropriate persistence. I simply listened and occasionally offered observations. You did more than that. You understood from the beginning that this wasn't a simple story, that the village's explanations were too convenient to be entirely accurate, and you never suggested I should be satisfied with comfortable fictions when harder truths are available. After Lucy had departed, promising to write once she was settled back in London, Miss Marple returned to her chair by the window. The afternoon was drawing toward evening, and the winter light had acquired that particular quality of clarity that makes ordinary things seem briefly luminous. She thought about the album, soon to rest in the church archives where it would be available but not intrusive, preserved but not elevated to unwarranted significance. It was, she reflected, rather how Eleanor Pritchard herself had lived, present and contributing but never drawing attention to her own sacrifices or seeking recognition for what she'd given up. The village would continue as it always had, its routines undisturbed by the revelations that most residents would never learn. Mrs. Bantry and Miss Debenham would carry their complicated knowledge privately, as would Colonel Wexford and Mrs. Helena Pritchard. The comfortable narrative about incompatibility and fortunate escapes would persist, because most people preferred stories that required no uncomfortable reconsideration of their own judgments. But the truth would exist as well, documented and preserved, waiting for whoever might someday care enough to look beyond surface explanations. That seemed to Miss Marple a reasonable compromise between honesty and discretion, between the obligation to preserve truth and the recognition that not all truths needed immediate proclamation. She thought of the three people in those restored photographs, young, hopeful, and utterly unaware of how circumstances would soon force them apart. They had faced their impossible situation with more grace than most people ever managed, had made choices that privileged others' welfare over their own happiness, and had lived with the consequences of those choices without demanding recognition or sympathy. That was worth remembering, Miss Marple thought, not as tragedy, though it had certainly contained tragic elements, but as evidence that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary selflessness when circumstances required it. Eleanor Pritchard had not lived the life she might have chosen, but she had lived the life she had chosen with remarkable dignity. That was achievement enough. The album had been brought down from the cupboard, its contents examined, and its truths gradually revealed. Now it would be closed again, but this time complete and accurately contextualized, its story preserved for future generations who might be able to see it with the clarity that contemporary scandal had prevented. Miss Marple folded her knitting and set it aside. The room had grown dim, and she rose to light the lamps against the gathering darkness. Outside, the village settled into its evening routines, each house showing its lighted windows like small beacons against the winter night. She thought about families and their albums, about the photographs people chose to preserve and those they chose to remove, about the stories they told and the truths they kept wrapped carefully away. Every family had its complications, its difficult choices, its sacrifices made in the name of protection or duty or love. Most of those stories remained forever private, known only to those directly involved and carried silently until death released them from the obligation of secrecy. But occasionally, through some accident of preservation or the determination of someone like Lucy, the fuller story emerged, and when it did, it usually proved to be both sadder and more honourable than the simplified version everyone had accepted. The album had not been cursed by what it revealed.